Hello Internet, welcome to the channel. My name is Frankie and in today's video we are going to be building our first dual species habitat, and that is for the Probiscus monkey and the Asian small-clawed otter. One of my favourite zoos in the UK is Longleat Safari Park, and one of the enclosures that stands out most to me is an island on which they used to hold gorillas but now it is monkeys, and I wanted to try and replicate that kind of thing in my zoo. So with this massive trench that I dug out last time when marking out where my exhibits were going to be, I am just going to fill this with water, have a bit of an underwater viewing gallery, and try to have an island on which all my monkeys live on. And it's going to take a bit of work, a bit of figuring out how to get each thing to work properly. The first thing that I'm doing is using a wide range of different shaped boulders, going around the edge, trying to make it as climb proof as possible, but also making it look natural. The idea for this enclosure is to not have a wall around the edge, but instead just have this rock face be there and use a null barrier to stop any of the animals actually escaping their enclosure. Hopefully this works, but it is going to take a bit of adjusting here and there, I think, to get it working just right. Now, I could have created a sort of template where I use 5 or so boulders and then copy and paste them around the perimeter of this enclosure, but I decided I wanted to place each one individually, and whilst this did take more time, it kind of negates the possibility of having any repeat patterns coming up and makes it look completely random across the entire habitat. Once I was happy with where the boulders and rocks were placed around the perimeter of this enclosure, I decided to start sketching in where the paths were going to be, and this led me to my first realisation of the fact that I should have planned where the underwater viewing gallery was going to be a bit earlier than this. I had built the stones and boulders all the way around this enclosure, which is great, it looks nice and natural. But where is the underwater viewing gallery going to go? So I decided to move a bunch of the boulders, bring them a bit back away from the side of the enclosure, and then that would allow me to figure out where I was going to place the path and all that. That took a bit of doing, a bit of figuring out how to actually use the pathing tools more effectively. I had to turn on tunneling to ensure that the path could dip underground. I had to smooth out some of the ground surface around the path because unfortunately, it wouldn't let me alter the terrain if the area dug out was the way it was, so I had to flatten that to the surrounding area, which is a bit annoying. Once the path was at a height that I was happy with, I then had to remove the ground that I had added back into place earlier, and then I could start to put the boulders back around the edges just to try and blend it in a little bit more. Didn't take much time, but the actual figuring out of how to sync the path and get it looking nice and straight and stuff, that did take a bit of time. This is one of those things you're going to have to practice with, and you will get it eventually, but yeah, first time is going to be a bit finicky and tricky. Now obviously if we left it like this, the water would just cover the path and the guests would get completely soaked. They'd have to swim across this bit and the animals would escape. So the way to create our actual viewing gallery here is to use a glass barrier and bridge the gap between the two rock kind of edges that we've created. Bridge that gap, and then we'll be filling this area with water a little bit later, meaning that the guests can see into the enclosure underwater from here. To make this glass barrier look a little less out of place, I decided to use some thin bits of stone and rock and line the top of the glass panes. This just helps blend it into the rest of the enclosure, and there are also points where the glass panels are actually separated. There are some vertical lines. I also put some stone pillars on those as well, just to make it look as though it's the stones that are holding all these bits of glass together, rather than them just being freestanding. After this, I tried to fill this area with water, and I quickly discovered that there was a leak somewhere. I hadn't made the glass barrier go completely into the terrain around it, and therefore there was a leak that would mean the water would flow under where the path is, and that's something that we need to fix. So to do this, I had to extend the barriers and play about with their height and stuff to make sure they blended in as smoothly as possible. When it comes to the brick pillars on the end of the glass panes, I decided to plonk a rock on top of those just to make them not visible to the public or anyone else for that matter. They just blend straight into the stone surrounding. It did take quite a lot to get this just right, but once I did, I was able to fill it with water, which meant I could get the water back out and build our island. When it came to building the island, I built it in the opposite way to which I made this massive crater, and that is to go to the stamp terrain tool, select the cylinder, as it doesn't really matter what shape you use, but I prefer cylinder. I then set it to add terrain, got it to a height and width I was happy with, and then just sketched out an area that I thought would be good, a good amount of space for animals to actually live on. Once that space was in place, that's a bit of a rhyme that was unintentional, I could smooth out the edges so that the animals could actually get in and out of the water, and then I was going to start to decorate a little bit more. When it came to building a house for where these animals were going to live, I took ages to figure out what I wanted to do. I played about with some of the blueprints already in game, and I then decided to build a quite large building for them to sleep in, as it's going to be 2 different species. And I ended up even just deleting that and starting over again. But one issue that I ran into fairly early on was thinking about how the keepers are going to replenish all the food and items that just need topping up from time to time. That was something I hadn't thought about, and there were a couple ways I could have dealt with this. You could have used a bridge, but then how do you stop the animals from getting across the bridge and escaping themselves? Or I could have used a tunnel, but at this stage, with all of the rocks and stuff in place, it just felt like it would take way too long to figure out how to make a tunnel that worked effectively. So the solution that I landed on and ended up doing was to create a large building where we could place all of the animals' food items, all of their feeding trays and food enrichment items, and that would be located on land. I could then have that be accessible by the zookeepers, who obviously can't swim, but the animals can swim. So they need to be able to leave the building, swim across to the main island, where all of their toy enrichment and sleeping areas would be, meaning they only ever have to come to the building for food. And if the keepers can access that part of the enclosure, they can actually clean the entire enclosure without ever getting to the island. Although that doesn't make much sense, that is how it works, so that is a really good workaround for what was quite an issue. And that is what I decided to do, and it ends up working really well. Here you can see me building my first attempt at a house for them. I'm choosing to stick with the East Asia theme, but there's just something about this building. No matter how many decorations I had, I could tell as I was doing it, it just wasn't going to look that great. So I end up stopping and starting to build a second building and trying to figure out if that would work better or not. And if it does, then I'll just delete this one and go with the second option instead. So the second building that I end up making as a potential home for these animals is a round one. It's completely circular. The edges aren't entirely smooth, but you know, it has that basic shape. It took a little bit of doing. It's not something I've done before, but I'm really happy with the result. If you'd like to see a more in-depth tutorial on how to make circular buildings, make sure to let me know in the comments, because I think I've got this figured out now and wouldn't mind making a video for you guys to be able to do this in your own zoo. Once I'd got the basic shape of it, I was able to take out some of the walls at the front and put an archway in there so that the animals could get out and go across to their island. I made sure that the front wasn't blocked in any way so that the animals could get across to the island and enjoy all of their toy enrichment and their sleeping areas without anything getting in the way. As I was mainly focusing on getting the right shape and ensuring that this building was completely functional, I really didn't decorate it that much. I added a few lights and a few beams here and there at the front of the building, because that's the part that's in the enclosure that the guests are going to be seeing mostly, as I'm going to surround the rest with trees and plants. So I wanted that little bit to be a bit prettier, but other than that I really didn't go too wild on this house, as I want the island itself to be the main focal point for this enclosure. And here's a little shot of how we were looking at this point once the dome was done and it was time to start filling in that island. The first thing to do was to get the Probiscus monkey in so I could see what terrain they needed changing. I could then adjust the terrain distribution using the painting brushes to just change the environment for them get it to exactly what they need. Also, I put all of their food and food enrichment items inside the dome. Luckily, I had most of it unlocked because of 1, the red panda, and 2, some lemurs that I'd researched previously, so most of their enrichment was already unlocked. It's also worth noting that I have run a null barrier around this entire enclosure and placed a door on the building that the animals are feeding from. When it came to adding the plant life to this enclosure, I went mad with it. I really wanted this island to be something that would draw the attention of all of our guests, so I decided to go really big with our trees and have a really heavy ground coverage. And luckily, the Probiscus monkey has a really high coverage threshold, so I could go absolutely crazy with it. I decided not to place many rocks on the actual island because this entire enclosure is surrounded by rocks, so I thought it might be a bit of overkill. So I focused mainly on big trees and big bushes and shrubs, just to really make this feel like it's in the heart of a jungle or rainforest. And although I didn't go absolutely crazy with the rocks, I did make a small outcropping in the middle of the island, just as a kind of central point for the monkeys to do their climbing and stuff. I can add our climbing structures to that later on, just as a natural starting point. Now, there is a lot of plant placement here, and I could try to talk through all of it, but also I would be repeating myself and rambling a little bit. So I'm going to put this in time lapse, put on a little bit of music, and just let you enjoy, and then we'll come back for some more enrichment for the animals in a minute. Now that I was happy with the plant coverage, I decided to tap on one of our Probiscus monkeys and check their traversable area. Although I've been pretty careful with placing the boulders around the edge, there's every chance they might be able to escape, and here you can see they could. The blue indicates where the animals are able to travel, and you can see there's a little bit of rock they can climb up there. So what I have to do is go around and adjust the rocks at the edge of the enclosure, making sure they're high enough that the animals can't climb out. I had to do this in, I think, about 3 places. It wasn't too bad, didn't require too much work, but it's something you really should check if you're making an enclosure entirely from null barriers, because there is every chance the animals will escape. Now, you can see here that it hasn't registered that I've changed the rock, and that is fine. What you need to do is unpause the game, because at the moment time is paused, and then the animal will refresh its traversable area, and you'll get a more accurate reading of what it can do. So this was just my own silly mistake, and I didn't need to adjust it even further. Once I had established that there was no way the animals could escape, I hopped back over to the island, and it was time to add some climbing frames for our monkeys. I was going to build from scratch, but ultimately I decided to just place a bunch of the blueprints all over this island. I made it jam-packed. Really, there isn't much walking space. These animals are going to have so much fun climbing all over the island, and that is exactly what I wanted. I want to be able to see these animals at various heights. If you're seeing this island from where the guests are, then them being on the ground, they're going to be a lot harder to see if they're just in amongst the bushes. So giving them the opportunity to do all this climbing really means that the guests are going to get the best view possible, and it just enriches the animals' lives in general. So I went crazy with placing these blueprinted climbing frames, and I actually kind of like the finished look where it's all just crammed together and looks really busy. Once all the climbing frames were sorted, I could start to dive into the other toy enrichment, and that included a mud bath, some foraging pits, some ball games, some sprinklers, all the fun stuff for our animals to be playing with, including a submarine buoy or buoy, depending on where you're from, that floats in the water, which means that the animals can just whack it about, which I think is rather cute. And after a busy day of playing on this island, you're going to need somewhere to sleep. So I use a basic wooden shelter that's already made from a blueprint, place it at the edge that I'd been keeping clear of this island, and then cover it in leaves and hay to make sure the animals have a nice place to rest their head after a long day of swimming and playing about. At this point I added even more plants to the island just because I wanted to fill some more space. And I decided that the waterways looked a little bit empty, and I realised I hadn't placed any water growing plants. So I grabbed a bunch of reeds and ran them around the perimeter of the island, and then I grabbed even more lilies and placed them everywhere, filling this waterway, making it look alive and tropical, just like the island itself. In the background you can see a little Probiscus monkey climbing onto the island for the first time. Hopefully it has a bit of fun. Yeah, this was the last step of plants that I decided to take. Place loads of these everywhere. Now, just before we get on to adding the final animals and then having a look at how this island looks when it's completely finished, I just wanted to show you how our zoo is looking from an aerial point of view at the moment. Currently we have 6 enclosures with 7 species, and I'm really happy with how this zoo is going. I've got to do a bunch of detail work filling in the areas between enclosures and stuff to make the zoo look a lot prettier, but I thought I'd just give you a little look at how it's going so far. If you've watched all the way to the end of the video, I would just like to say a huge thank you and maybe suggest that you consider giving this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe to see how the rest of Little Asia pans out over the coming weeks. I have a lot in store and you don't want to miss it. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.